from Crashing Through, a story of Mike May, a quote, "The brain imposes knowledge in order to see. But I think there might also be beauty in not imposing knowledge, in being open to everything, in being open to every possible interpretation. In ways, there's something liberating about my vision, in the sense that so much of what I see can be anything. It's fascinating to think that an object or even a person can be anything. It means that almost anything can be beautiful." Mike May said this several years after restoration of his sight in one eye. He lost his sight as a small child and regained it in his 40s. He had no visual memory to help him recognize what he was looking at. He couldn't even recognize his wife. Claude Monet and the Futurists, amongst others, were also addressed the encumbrance of memory in appreciating beauty. From Art and Physics by Leonard Shlain, Monet once said he wished he had been born blind and later gained sight. That way he would be able to look at the world free of the knowledge of what the objects were, so that he could more appreciate color. Robert Hughes comments on the early 20th century futurist artist Marinetti in Shock of the New. Marinetti's enemy was the past. He attacked history and memory and with operatic zeal, and a wide range of objects and customs fell under his disapproval, from Giovanni Bellini altarpieces to the eradicable Italian love of pasta. This dichotomy between the ability to see and the dependence upon memory to determine what we see is of primary concern to artists. Our past expectations become a hindrance to our experiencing beauty in the present. It is in the creation of a relationship of visual objects to memory that matters, that makes art. An experience concerning this relationship of shapes and other visual information not remembered as names or things or otherwise identifiable objects becomes metaphoric of what the artist sees. A change is required in the way we look at things. A shift, as it turns out, to a different part of our brain. Our minds evolved by natural selection to solve problems that were life and death matters to our ancestors, not to commune with correctness or to answer any question we are capable of thinking. This from Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. From necessity, we learn to deal with information quickly by reducing it, what we observe, to manageable size. This information must be processed by our brain to be identified and an appropriate response generated. All this in a fraction of a second. We have been forced to see in terms of what we conceptualize and know from memory. I see what is happening, compare it with previous experiences, and feel emotion. Is this feeling one of fear or joy? Do I stand or run? Do I respond or disregard? This reductionist way of interpreting visual data is imprinted in our brain. An example of this is the way we understand the human face and body. We think profiles and straight-on views, not three-quarter ones or foreshortening. You think of a hand like this, not like this. This is exemplified in the art of ancient Egypt. Look at this Egyptian stele in this slide. Note the head, hips, Legs and feet are all in profile, while the shoulders, chest, and hands are in frontal view, all avoiding any foreshortening. This is the way we think these body ports, not what we really see. Our vision is influenced by social construct and technical convention as well. We might think a king more important than his servant, and an artist might paint him larger. Thus, artists must often unlearn what they know about familiar objects, people, and social norms, and look at them in a fresh and altered way and see what is really there. This involves not looking at a foot as a foot, but instead seeing it as a shape of different tones and colors proportional to the rest of the figure. Lining up, sighting angles, and measurements are often necessary. Note that this process of not looking at the subject in familiar terms, as foot, toes, toenails, and heel, is necessary to encourage that part of our thinking which deals with concept and the abstract to relinquish control, allowing the creative part to do what it does best, that is, see the foot in order to draw it. Gravity and light are well known to the artist. If shadow doesn't ground an object, bind it properly, or to place and time, then something seems amiss. Take away shadows and perspective, and what have you got? A feeling of displacement or unease. We have learned that shadows give us a sense of time and placement. They are part of our subconscious thinking, as with perspective, indicating depth. This slide is an example of what happens when the artist plays on these expectations. Giorgio de Chirico was a master at putting the viewer in an unreal place where vanishing points made no sense and shadows indicated a time of day contrary to that of the light, a place that could only exist inside our imagination. Our perception of a constant shape and lightness across changes in viewing conditions tracks the object's inherent properties, from Pinker. The most dramatic example of this perceptual consistency concerns color. We learn to recognize a lion in all lighting conditions, in the sun coming through the trees and the grass, and in the shadow of a rock. In our mind, the lion retains the same color in all situations, though physically its color may vary considerably. This color constancy, or local color, as artists like to call it, follows what Semir Zeki refers to as the golden rule of perception, namely comparison. The brain looks at colors and shapes in relationship to their surrounds and is able to see the same yellow no matter what the conditions. The ratio of the amount of light of differing wavelengths never changes. Information must be simplified and codified in order to be processed in the moment. The rules we use to gather information for survival often break down when compared with actually seeing what's really there. The yellow in the shade may in fact be violet, but because of neighboring colors, we still see the same yellow. Our brains necessarily simplify as too much data can clog the system and prevent identification and timely action. Throughout history, scholars have noted the duality of our thinking. However, not until SPIE conceived of surgically dividing the two hemispheres of the brain, known as a commissurotomy, and with the subsequent advent of brain imaging systems, such as the MRI and CAT scans, to give a picture of the brain's activity, were different responses of each cortex observed. Characteristics of each side of the brain were identified. Typical features of the left were found to be linear, timed, logical, and rational thinking, that is, doing and abstraction. Typical features of the right hemisphere were found to be imagination, spatial cognition, intuition, holistic thinking, and all-at-once perception. Being, metaphor. As one might conclude from these hemispheric polarities, the scientist who relies on empirical study requiring a logical, linear, and conceptual methodology thinks mainly from the left side, while the artist who takes a more creative, holistic, and emotional approach sees from the right. Metaphor is the cornerstone of fine art. There is a layering of different planes of comprehension. Unlike worlds of thought that are linear and logical, relationships are implied and directly expressed within a work. Realizing parallels often flies in the face of much thinking, as they must be experienced and seen and not sequentially explained or thought. For example, a Cézanne painting of a bowl of fruit is not an appetizing depiction of a set, but a set of relationships of shapes and planes of color. These reflect artists' need for balance and equilibrium, even though the table would surely topple in the real world. As Joseph Campbell points out, quote, "One does not want to eat a Cézanne apple," end quote, but rather experience the visual truth of it within the confines of the canvas. It is in understanding the relationships between the objects depicted and those of the objects of one's own experience, both visual and personal, that leads one to truly see the work of art before him. The still life is a painting of what he sees. The painting becomes a metaphor for understanding everything else. Again, as Campbell puts it, quote, "Nothing within the field," that is the border of the painting, "has reference to anything outside the field. Within that field, what is important is what is here and here. The relationship of part to whole, and of the whole to each of its parts. And when that relationship is fortunately achieved, you have claritas, radiance, fascination, aesthetic arrest. Aha! You are held," end quote. Because artists and scientists employ different methodologies in trying to understand who we are and what we are striving to achieve, in the end we come to understand the same thing in very different ways. We create new languages to explain what we have discovered. Scientists communicate truth through experimental reasoning, while artists communicate through visual metaphor. Perhaps it's the inability to translate these languages that causes such conflict between the two, and perhaps helps polarize society as well. At last year's conference, I presented the idea of environmental stereoscopic art as a way of becoming more aware or more conscious of the visual process and consequently gain greater insight into consciousness itself. I turned to ChromaDepth 3D glasses. These rely on differing refractions of incoming light for each eye, thereby placing colors at various distances from the viewer. Due to the spontaneity afforded by these glasses, by not having to create two images, the resulting change in consciousness from left to right brain thinking is palpable. I'll just do this very quickly as I see I'm out of time. This work, The Mechanics of Understanding, comes close to the way I see the world. Edges are at once sharp and distinct, yet as I look, the shapes change. They're one way now, another way depending upon my focus. And I feel the presence of other forces in my head as I look. But as I look, it makes sense to me, aesthetic sense, emotional sense. One cannot see it in only one glimpse. And I apologize for cutting this short. This work, Can You Read Me?, may give a limited view of visual space created by layers of writing. The marks are inextricably tangled with each other, and yet the mind detects an order within the apparent chaos. Using the 3D ChromaDepth glasses, the layers become visually separated, allowing me to better appreciate the image. One must indeed be in their right mind in order to read me. Well, obviously I don't have time for the rest of this, but I would like to just say that somebody asked me, well, so what? What's this all about? By going back to the root of our perception, we may take full advantage of the new technologies that are becoming available by trying to step around our expectations, our preconceptions, and not just follow those in logical conclusions. If we don't, we're just making an updated fancy TV or a new type of atom bomb. Thank you.